During a trial in a quaint English town, the prosecutor leaned in closer to his first witness, an elderly lady named Mrs. Jones. He asked her, "Do you know me, Mrs. Jones?" With a steely gaze, Mrs. Jones replied, "Yes, I know you, Mr. Williams. I've known you since you were a little troublemaker, and frankly, you've turned into one of life's biggest letdowns. You're constantly spinning lies, betraying your spouse, manipulating folks, and spreading gossip. You're like an overconfident turkey with barely a speck of intelligence to make something of yourself." The prosecutor was left nearly speechless and unsteady on his feet. After gathering his composure, he pointed towards someone in the courtroom and asked, "Do you know the defense attorney, Mrs. Jones?" Mrs. Jones responded without missing a beat, "Of course I do. I've known Mr. Bradley since he was a child, just like you. He's indolent, riddled with countless phobias, and has quite the alcohol problem. He can't find common ground with anyone and is renowned as the most inept lawyer in town. Not to mention, he's been unfaithful to his wife with 3 different women, one of whom happens to be your wife. So, yes, I'm quite familiar with him." As these words echoed in the courtroom, observers noticed the defense lawyer turning paler than a ghost. At that moment, the judge summoned both attorneys to the bench. The judge sternly warned them, "If either of you dares to inquire whether she knows me, I'll have no qualm sending you both straight to the electric chair." 2 gentlemen are sitting in a pub. One says to the other, "I am listening to you, and I have a feeling that you are from somewhere in the South." "Yes, you are absolutely right," the interlocutor answers. "Wow, what a coincidence! And I'm from the South. And where exactly did you live in the South?" "I'm from Jacksonville, Florida." "Unbelievable," exclaims the first mister. "I was born in Jacksonville, too. And what street did you live on there? This is a wonderful area, the central part of the city." "And me. And I'm there, too." "What school did you go to?" "To St. Mary's Church School." "But how could we not meet? I studied there, too. What year did you graduate from high school?" "In 1964. "It seems that God himself has blessed us. It's a miracle that we met." "I also graduated from high school in 1964. The bartender, glancing at the speakers and pouring beer to the visitor, who just entered, "It's going to be a fun night tonight. The White Twins got drunk again." Once upon a time, the renowned British actor Samuel Foote found himself spending the night in a quaint little town during his travels across the country. After ordering and thoroughly enjoying his lunch at the local inn, the innkeeper, with a courteous smile, asked him, "Did you find the meal to your liking, sir?" Samuel, in high spirits and feeling rather pleased with his meal, replied, "I must say today I've had the finest lunch in all of England." The innkeeper, with a knowing twinkle in his eye, chimed in, "Well, sir, except for our esteemed mayor, of course." Samuel, not one to back down from a playful exchange, retorted, "Nonsense, I stand by it. This was indeed the best lunch I've had." But the innkeeper wasn't about to let this pass. Once more he asserted, "Except for our mayor, sir." What started as a light-hearted exchange soon escalated into a full-blown dispute, and before he knew it, Samuel found himself being dragged before the town's mayor by the persistent innkeeper. The mayor, after hearing the innkeeper's complaint, informed Mr. Foote that in their town it was a solemn decree for all residents and visitors to show the utmost respect for the mayor and mention him on every possible occasion. Disregard of this decree could result in either a fine or even a day behind bars. Rather bemused by the absurdity of the situation, Samuel promptly paid the fine and, shaking his head at the remarkable tale, couldn't help but mutter to himself, "I've encountered many a fool in my life, but none quite like this innkeeper." Then, with a wry smile, he turned to the mayor and added, "Except for the mayor, of course." For a married couple, Mr. and Mrs. Stone, found themselves at the dentist's office one sunny afternoon. Mr. Stone, who seemed a bit impatient, wasted no time in setting the tone for the appointment. "No costly injections or any of your fancy dental tricks, Doc," Mr. Stone declared. "Just yank the tooth out, toss it away, and we'll be on our way." The dentist, Dr. Thornton, couldn't help but be impressed by Mr. Stone's bravado. He grinned and remarked, If only all my patients were as fearless as you, Mr. Stone. All right, let's get to it. Could you kindly point out which tooth needs removing? Mr. Stone, with a glance at his wife, turned to her and said, Honey, why don't you show the good doctor which tooth it is that's been causing you trouble? Mrs. Stone, who had been quietly observing the exchange, leaned back in the dental chair and opened her mouth. She pointed to a molar at the back of her mouth with a pained expression, clearly indicating the source of her discomfort. Dr. Thornton, ever the professional, donned his gloves and prepared to extract the troublesome tooth. As he was about to begin, he couldn't resist a touch of humor and said, Well, Mrs. Stone, it seems like you've got quite the reliable navigator in your husband here. Now, if you could just relax, we'll have that tooth out in no time. With a mixture of bravery and trepidation, Mrs. Stone clenched her fists and closed her eyes, bracing herself for the impending extraction. Dr. Thornton, true to his word, swiftly removed the troublesome tooth, and it was over in a matter of moments. As the dentist handed Mrs. Stone a tissue to dab her mouth, he couldn't help but smile at Mr. Stone and quip, You know, Mr. Stone, if ever I need a co-pilot for a dental journey, I'll be sure to call on you. You two make quite the team. The Stones left the dentist's office that day, toothache-free and with a shared story of bravery and humor that would undoubtedly become a cherished memory in their marriage. And as they strolled hand in hand down the street, they couldn't help but chuckle at the unexpected adventure they'd just experienced at the dentist's chair. 4 travelers from different parts of the world, an Englishman, a Cuban, an Indian, and a Frenchman, found themselves sharing a train compartment on a long journey. As they chugged along the scenic route, each traveler revealed a bit of their cultural quirks. The Frenchman, with an air of nonchalance, produced a bottle of fine wine, uncorked it, took a few sips, and then casually tossed the bottle out of the window. His fellow passengers stared in disbelief. Why on earth did you throw away such an expensive bottle of wine? They exclaimed in unison. The Frenchman shrugged and replied, Ah, mes amis, in France, we have an abundance of this exquisite wine. It's nothing out of the ordinary for us. As night descended, the Cuban traveler reached into his pocket and withdrew a cigar. He lit it, took a single puff, and flicked the smoldering cigar out of the window with a carefree gesture. Again, his companions were astonished. Are you not sorry for wasting that fine cigar? They asked. The Cuban grinned and replied, No need to fret, my friends. In Cuba, we have an endless supply of these cigars. It's a part of our everyday life. The next morning, as the train continued its journey, an unsettling turn of events took place. The Englishman, without uttering a word, abruptly stood up, grabbed the Hindu passenger in their compartment, and tossed him out of the window. Horrified and bewildered, the Frenchman, the Cuban, and the Indian survivor turned to the Englishman in shock. They demanded an explanation for his outrageous action. The Englishman, with a stoic expression, calmly replied, Lads, in England, we have an abundance of these bloomin' Hindus. They're everywhere. But I tell you, that fellow won't be throwing any more cigars or wine bottles out of this train. In a quaint English town, the day was filled with a sense of anticipation and celebration. The entire community buzzed with excitement as the chief of police's daughter was about to tie the knot. The streets were adorned with flowers, and the local church had been beautifully decorated for the wedding ceremony. Amidst all this festivity, an English policeman on duty spotted a car racing down the central street at a breakneck speed. With a stern look, he waved the vehicle to a halt. The car skidded to a stop, and the officer approached, his expression reflecting his disapproval of the reckless driving. The driver, with a hint of nervousness in his voice, stammered, I can explain, officer. The policeman, not in the mood for explanations, promptly cut him off with a stern command. Shut up! You'll have a chance to explain yourself to our boss. For now, you'll be sitting in the cell. The driver, frustrated and bewildered, attempted to plead his case further. But Once again, the officer interrupted, insisting, And I say, shut up. A few hours passed, and the officer, with a slight change in demeanor, entered the cell where the detainee had been waiting anxiously. "Seems like you might have lucked out, kid," the officer said with a touch of sympathy. "The chief's daughter is getting married today, and he's off attending the wedding. He'll be in a splendid mood when he returns." However, much to the officer's surprise, the groom-to-be sitting in the cell appeared far from relieved. He muttered gloomily, "I don't think so. I'm the groom." As the officer's realization dawned, he couldn't help but let out a hearty laugh at the unfortunate twist of fate. The detainee, though relieved of his impending trouble with the chief, found himself in the most unexpected of predicaments on what was supposed to be the happiest day of his life. The policeman's laughter filled the small cell, echoing through the police station's corridors. He couldn't believe the absurdity of the situation. Here he was, detaining the groom on his wedding day, all while the chief was blissfully unaware, celebrating his daughter's nuptials. Trying to contain his amusement, the officer finally said, "Well, lad, I suppose you've got yourself into quite the pickle, haven't you?" The groom managed a half-smile, a mix of resignation and humor. "Indeed, officer, it's safe to say my wedding day didn't quite go as planned." As the hours ticked by, the groom's fellow officers in the station couldn't resist teasing him. They shared anecdotes and jests about weddings gone awry and mishaps on the big day. It was a bizarre blend of camaraderie and irony, with the groom finding solace in the absurdity of his situation. Finally, evening fell, and the chief of police returned to the station, his face radiant with happiness from the day's events. He had been entirely focused on his daughter's wedding and had no idea of the events that transpired in his absence. Seeing the chief's joyful demeanor, the groom couldn't bear to spoil his mood. With a deep breath and a hopeful smile, he approached the chief and said, "Sir, I must apologize for any inconvenience earlier today. It was all a misunderstanding." The chief, enveloped in the euphoria of the wedding, simply patted the groom on the back and said, "No worries, lad. We all have our moments. Let's put it behind us and celebrate the joyous occasion that brought us all together." And so, in an ironic twist of fate, the groom's wedding day, which had started with him locked in a cell, transformed into a day filled with laughter, camaraderie, and an unexpected bond with the chief of police. It was a wedding tale that would be retold in the small English town for years to come, a reminder that sometimes life's most memorable moments arise from the unlikeliest of circumstances.